All right, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us. I appreciate your time. I know that history lessons aren't always of utmost importance in our daily lives, but our team put together a really good presentation and we worked hard on it. So I hope you guys learned something and get something out of it. Today's presentation is about the history of the Niagara region. So we conveniently separated the presentation into four sections. In section one, A Land Before Time, we're going to talk about what the geography of the region looked like tens of thousands of years before people settled it. In section two, The Founding of Niagara, we'll talk about the European colonization of the area. And then after that, we'll go over early Niagara townships. And finally, we'll go over Fort Niagara. All right. A little snippet, a little fun fact before we start off here. The history of the Niagara region can be traced back to 250 million years ago. Glaciers carved out a unique landscape that cannot be seen anywhere else in Canada. Early European settlers tamed the rivers, harnessing their power to run their mills and eventually electricity and irrigation. By the 20th century, farming intensified. With its abundance of warm summers and moderate winters, the region became known for its exceptional products and the area flourished. Moving on. So, as mentioned before in that previous slide, tens of thousands of years ago, the whole region was covered by icy glaciers. But approximately 14,000 years ago, the continent experienced a warming trend and the glaciers began to melt, which opened vast areas for vegetation, lakes, rivers, marshes, and waterfalls. Forests flourished in the warmer temperatures, and fish and waterfowl began to inhabit the streams. Berries and wild plants became the supplemental diet for indigenous people in the area. On this slide right here, we have a little graphic showing you that on the top left, 14,000 years ago, all that white area, that was all ice. That was just glaciers covering the area. And there was just a little bit of green vegetation. And 10,000 years later to 4,000 years ago, all that ice melted away and it became inhabitable land. Moving on. So a little bit about Niagara Falls themselves. The way it works is water is diverted from above the falls by a series of canals and tunnels. And then once the water goes over the falls, it continues to flow on into Lake Ontario. So Niagara Falls is made up of several waterfalls. The American Falls makes up 10% of the flow, while the Canadian and Horseshoe Falls makes up 90%. Niagara Falls has the largest volume of water cascading over it than any other waterfall in the world, and this power has been harnessed at the Sir Adam Beck generating station in Niagara Falls, Ontario. Section 2, the founding of Niagara. So this is the founding by European colonists, and it was mostly based on a need by the British military to supply provisions and provide military barricades to remote outposts in the region. So there was this French explorer named Jacques Cartier, and the King of France commissioned him to explore the region to search for gold, spices, and a northern passage to Asia. So Jacques Cartier went on 3 expeditions through the St. Lawrence River, one in 1534, one from 1535 to 1536, and a third one from 1541 to 1542. And there was a second French explorer named Samuel de Champlain. He was another French explorer commissioned by the king, and his specialty was cartography or map making. So what his responsibility was to investigate the coast in search of an ideal location for settlement. And he went on his expedition in 1603. All right, moving on. So before the European colonists got there, of course, as throughout the story of all of North America, there were indigenous people inhabiting the land beforehand. And since they were so familiar with the land and all of its features, they were instrumental in helping Britain win the War of 1812 against the US, and they also guided early colonists to Upper Canada. When Jacques Cartier arrived in 1534 from France, he encountered Indians known as Iroquois, which was one of the 4 tribes that we're going to discuss today. A second tribe, the Huron, was discovered by Samuel de Champlain in 1603, which was almost 70 years after Jacques Cartier arrived. And Samuel de Champlain encountered completely different Indians with uncommon customs and languages, and he called these people the Huron. The Huron were constantly at war with the Iroquois. Another group was called the Tobacco Nation or the Petun, and they resided near the Niagara River. They cultivated tobacco, hence their name, and traded with Indian neighbors, which could have played a role into why other tribes did not seek war with them. And lastly, out of the four tribes were the neutrals or the Adawandaron. I hope I pronounced that right, but here we go. They were named by Samuel de Champlain as well because of their neutrality when dealing with their rivals. They resided near the Niagara River and Lake Ontario. Moving on. So, where does the word Niagara come from? There's a few theories about where it came from, and we'll discuss them here. It is presumed that Niagara results from the Iroquoian word Ongiara. The name appears on maps as early as 1641, and the typically accepted meaning is the Straits. Another theory is that people believe that Niagara is taken from another native word meaning thundering waters, which kind of describes how big the Niagara Falls are, describing the immense volume of water coming through it. And lastly, another theory of the name's origin suggests that Niagara is derived from the name given to a local group of Aboriginals called the Niagara people. Okay. All right, moving on. So a little bit more in-depth details about the four tribes. The Iroquois tribe, or Haudenosaunee, are an Iroquoian indigenous confederacy in Northeast North America. The Huron tribe, which were the Iroquois' rivals, were a tribe of farmers, hunter-gatherers, and fishermen who made excellent use of their birch bark canoes. The Petun tribe, or the Tobacco Nation, were known for cultivating tobacco, or Petun. And lastly, the Adawandaron tribe, or the Neutrals, established their territory between Lake Ontario and the Grand River, which stretches between Kitchener and Toronto. So this picture right here is Governor General Frederick Haldeman. He was the governor of Quebec and created a plan to settle experienced farmers in the Niagara region. So up until this point, the supplies for the forts and military in the region were coming all the way from Britain. So as you could probably think about this, there's a lot of problems with that method. It's really far, so it takes a long time for the supplies to get there, and a lot of stuff could happen to the supplies on its journey. So again, Frederick Haldeman created a plan to settle experienced farmers in the region, but the problem was that the native Mississauga people already settled the land. So their solution to that was that General Haldeman just purchased the land from the natives, and that's where he began to colonize it. And this is around the year 1778, by the way. All right, so his plan was approved, and new settlers were given a horse to clear the land. And after a year, any produce grown on their property that they weren't using for personal use would be sold to the military around them. There were 5 loyalist families that settled in the western area of Niagara. They demanded land repayment in exchange for military enlistment. All right, so land grants, an important word here. In 1783, Britain announced land grants to its loyal subjects. Families were granted land according to family size and rank of military servicemen. The British were enlightened with the advantage of veterans settling the land. So the reason why Britain started introducing these land grants was because initially the military only allowed farmers to use the land, but not to own it. So they didn't actually have any property. These farmers would come in and they'd be cultivating crops and supplies, and they'd give it to the military, but they weren't being properly compensated. And at that time, military enlistment for the British military was pretty low. So these land grants boosted enlistment. It would make sense that they'd want to have a bigger family to send more people into the military, and they'd want their family members to occupy higher ranks. So it was kind of smart on Britain's end. And you can see on the right of this slide, there's a pretty interesting graphic. Section 3, Early Niagara Townships. All right, in the early 1800s, the newcomers' experience of the land. The population of Niagara grew at such a rate that new settlers would find a place even in the wilderness and just lay claim to it. It became necessary to divide the territory into counties and townships. The new American settlers began to arrive near Lake Erie. They were known as United Empire Loyalists because they rejected the new government in the US. And there were other groups as well, like the Quakers and Mennonites. Their religion didn't allow military duty, so many of them settled inland away from any fighting. New townships. This picture right here is Governor John Simcoe. And in 1792, Governor Simcoe called a meeting of the first legislature at Niagara. He declared a proclamation of the forming of new provinces and fixing boundaries for electoral districts. He also divided Upper Canada into 19 counties. Each of these counties would be named after a county in England or Scotland, and the townships were named after an original town or village, also in England or Scotland. All right, the first district was named Niagara, and Governor Simcoe actually renamed it to Newark, but people just kept calling it Niagara, and that's the name that stuck today. Later on, one of the counties earned the additional name Niagara-on-the-Lake, just to distinguish it from the county Niagara Falls. Settlement of York County. So in the 1700s, you can see in this map to the right, there's that yellow circled area where the French royalist settlement started. All right, and last section, we have Fort Niagara. So the reason why we wanted to add Fort Niagara to its own section was because it's an iconic landmark. It sits right on the river and oversees everything that goes through it, and it's a vital piece of Canadian history. The fort was originally built by the French in 1689 on the west bank of the Niagara River at Lake Ontario, which is on the American side. It was abandoned, then rebuilt again in 1725 as an important military installation controlling the route to the Ohio Valley. And so this is still in French control. But in 1759, the British military occupied it, and until 1796, it was under British control, and then finally it was passed to the Americans. So Fort Niagara, as I mentioned earlier, was built by the French to facilitate trade with the Aboriginal people. In this picture on the right side of the slide, you can see some of the goods that were commonly traded. On the left side of the slide, you can see that it was a pretty simple fort and it was made out of wood, but later the wood wasn't strong enough, so it was reconstructed and made out of stone. All right, lastly, British control. Similar to the French, the British would continue to operate the fort mainly as a trading post and a rendezvous point for expeditions. That's all for our presentation today, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it and learned something. If you'd like to watch the recording of this presentation once more, you could definitely visit our Niagara page. The link is listed there. And if you have any suggestions on topics or resources, feel free to email us at connected.communities@cyberseniors.org.